West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
These readings are taken from Dave Patterson's book, 500 Years of Lies, Discover the Extraordinary Number of Native Indian Gifts to the World. At the end of our readings, we customarily invite you, if you wish to do so, to join us in the affirmation, offered us wisdom for the journey, and we may say together, may we walk in its light. So the first reading today is Iroquois women were the landowners and the farmers. In most Western Hemisphere indigenous philosophies, women were the ones who gave life to humans, so they were in turn the ones who gave life. So they were in turn the ones in charge of giving life from the earth. 75% of the foods grown in the world today were gifts from the Americas. When we look at these provisions being cultivated on indigenous farms, we realize there were a lot of women developing food on these farms. And the second reading. Iroquois women nominated the chiefs, and they could also have them kicked out of office. This is another thing that scared the people operating the noble or feudal systems in Europe. The community could actually remove someone from office, and the women played a large part in these decisions. Offered us wisdom for the journey. May we walk in its light. And over to Babette for our next song. This is Dave's second visit to us, and Dave is an inspirational speaker, and as I've already mentioned, he's the author of 500 Years of Lies, Discover the Extraordinary Number of Native Indian Gifts to the World. For those of you who don't remember, Dave grew up in southern Ontario and he's lived in Toronto for the last 35 years. And his passion for this subject dates back over 20 years to while he was listening to a radio broadcast in his car. Today, Dave will pick up his theme on the day when we celebrate mothers, with women's rights that can be directly tracked back to the Iroquois Confederacy. This influence has travelled all around the world. And it's also well documented that early suffragettes were good friends with many Iroquois women and were influenced by them. So, Dave, thank you for joining us, and I'm handing over the baton to you now. Thank you.
I'm going to slide this over. Didn't get to meet John last time, so it was nice to see him. We've emailed many times. My openings aren't regular. I have a
Dave, you have to speak into the microphone.
This is a new talk for me. My openings aren't really regular, so I wanted to just segue off and mention something that Scott, when he brought up that, I don't know if you'd call it an axiom, one of the original principles, that really stuck in my mind about trying to, I guess it's equivalent to you meet people who you know have never said anything bad about anyone, It's like this ideal you can strive for. And the idea of what Scott was saying, that whenever you're constructing something, it should be applicable to everyone. And so I was thinking, boy, I don't think I can live up to that one in my talk, but that's what I'm going to try for. So that's what idealism is, I think, right? We want to do the right thing even when there is no hope for it. So we, regardless of how the realities are, people say, well, this is what we should be doing. But you can't have that. Well, this is what should we be doing. Well, you can't have that. You always want to be striving for it. So that's what I will do. So a Mother's Day commemoration to our Western Hemisphere. This will be a story of balance, of respect, motherhood, and all the aspects that go with that, and a few hidden aspects when we look at the females, I guess, down through history. Let's attend a convention together. I'm going back to Seneca Hills, New York in 1848. So we'll spend a few minutes on that first. I'll share my time there with you, and we'll look at some of the results of that 1848 convention. The convention was actually conceived in 1840 in London, England. There was an anti-slavery convention that took place in 1840. And many of the same people that went on in the suffragette movement, and there's only 4 or 5 that I mention or focus, but there's many more, and all over the world, each country tended to have their own people that they might revere for having contributed those ideas to that particular country or to that society. So it is different around the world, but they all got together and they all fed off each other's inspiration. And it was at anti-slavery conference in 1840 where some North American women were there, and that planted the seeds for this Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So the driving force behind it was Elizabeth Stanton, and that's a name of Susan Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Matilda Gage, Elizabeth Stanton. You sometimes hear these names, mostly Susan Anthony probably, but Elizabeth Stanton is pretty well known. She was the driving force behind this convention. 300 people attended, and there was 40 men. The men were invited to go, but it was a 2-day convention. It took over the little town of Seneca Falls, New York, I'm sure. It was a 2-day convention, so people were staying over for a couple days. The men were asked not to contribute anything the first day, but the second day they could speak up. So it was a convention in particular for women, and it was in some ways the emanating of women's rights, and women were just starting to feel, well, this isn't really right the way things are set up, that it's officially makes us a second-class citizen. And so she did have the Declaration of Sentiments that she made up ahead of time, and she had some people that helped her with that. And the 300 attendees had dialogues throughout the time. They had lectures and they had talks, but it was centered around this Declaration of Sentiments. And at the end, they did come up with some resolutions as well, too. So it was built on the following, the sort of borrowing the traditions of democracy and freedom, which is something that America is known for. America is known for that because they did borrow it from the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, I call it the Iroquois Confederacy. It's really the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Iroquois is a derogatory term, as many of the native terms that we have, when we translate them into their language, it turns out that one of their rival tribes or some French or English or Dutch or somebody kind of gave them the name, but when you look at it in their language, it means something that's really not very nice. Iroquois is an example of that. So, but you do use the term, as I mentioned last week, I use the term Indian as well, but in a well-researched way, and not meaning to go against the protocol, especially in Canada, where that's considered not really an appropriate term. But I use it because there isn't a good term for the Western Hemisphere indigenous, all 3,500 nations up and down Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic. all of those nations, and they did all have things in common, and they had some contiguous elements. So we're kind of missing a term, which in writing I use WHI, Western Hemisphere Indigenous. So some of these terms, I guess we haven't come to terms with our terms, basically. So I do use that. Elizabeth Stanton's idea were radical and new. They were utopian ideas, as many of the European philosophers throughout the 1700s and 1800s. What was happening in North America, especially in the North, got a lot of attention. Western Hemisphere did have a lot of autocratic governments. It wasn't all voluntary governments and quote, democracies, but in the North in particular was known for that. And around the Great Lakes, where we did have the Iroquois Confederacy, they had a system that had been in place since 1142, where they did have a constitution. They did have the two houses, which is equivalent to what the United States tried to create in 1776 and failed, and redid it in 1778 because they couldn't agree unanimously, as the indigenous normally did in all of their government systems. The Congress did create a resolution in the 1980s that specifically mentioned that, the 25 similarities, and how the Constitution in the United States did borrow from the Iroquois Confederacy. So the making of their society ties in with the government system that they had, the fact that the women essentially ran the government system. It was certainly a matriarchal system, and some would call it a matriarch in terms of the name of the actual, what type of system was it. So these were radical ideas, and of course, where would she get ideas as radical and utopian as this from? I mean, the way she grew up, the way all the women in the New England states and in Europe grew up. And the answer to that is from the Iroquois women. Now, these societies did live very close together with one another. And so these radical ideas did not grow up within the patriarchy, which is where these women we're going to talk about did grow up. There was a clash of civilizations, of course, just all the way up and down all the coastlines. The indigenous normally were very welcoming to all Europeans, but there was immediately many clashes of the civilizations. One of them in the north was that the Europeans would only deal with the men. They just looked away from the women. And so right from the get-go, you've got a disconnect, because they could not understand this. Why are they just dealing with the men? And the European people couldn't understand, why are they bringing the women and putting the women in front of us? And it never worked at all, because it was just two completely different systems, and similar all down the line with their farming and the way they raised their kids, there's so many examples of that. They were just completely 180 from one another in certain regards. So the government system that the Iroquois had, that Elizabeth Stanton was borrowing from, and so we're talking 1848, and what the American government had borrowed from in the century before, throughout the 1700s, eventually making the Declaration of Independence, creating the two houses, duplicating a lot of what the Iroquois had, which was the world's first democracy, not Greece, because they were half slaves. The women were actually owned. They were chattel, they were property. The old people had no say, the young people had no say, and so we stand in our education, what were we taught? Everything good and great had to come from Europe, so the Greeks had the first democracy. Well, that's not a real democracy. The Iroquois Confederacy, working from 1142, 875 years ago, that was a real democracy. And the women constructed that. They nominated the leaders. They were the ones who checked on the leaders to see if they were doing what they were supposed to do. They were the ones who would be reported to if they did need to remove someone from office. And it was also the lineage in a lot of the northern Indians, particularly in the Iroquois, ran through the woman's side as well, too. And that's another thing that made it a non-patriarchal system. So there was a balance to this system in a governmental sense, also within the tribes, within the clans, within the household. There was an attempt to create a balance, and we talked about the sustainability last time during Earth Day, something that could stand the test of time, that wasn't just built on change being required continuously. And I mean, growth is good for us as people, and growth is good as humanity. As I say, I'm happy to never really have had any toothaches and some of these sorts of things. So again, we can't get to the point where we're down on progress, but there has to be something that makes something able to last and a sense of satisfaction setting in. And I believe that's what Elizabeth Stanton was partly borrowing from. The women were dissatisfied. It was quite clear and put in writing and was part of their system that they were a second-class citizen. They were inferior to men. And that's something that was well documented officially to do with race as well, too. And we deal with that today. I mean, that's partly that the indigenous were inferior to Europeans. We still fall back on that sort of trope. The idea that, well, there was a bunch of savages running around out in the woods with their diapers on and stuff. And that, so it's been proven that that's wrong. And the women were fighting back against that. They had had a taste of it with the Iroquois women that they knew. And just the same way that the leaders had seen during the 16 and 1700s how the Iroquois ran their system, and they borrowed that when they went to do their own government system. Now the women were also wanting to borrow what they saw, how they saw the Iroquois women living, which was always pretty much integrated into the society. There wasn't really a difference. There's this balance between the sexes. And that wasn't just something that was a coincidence. This was built down, although they had mostly oral systems in the oral record systems in the Iroquois Confederacy. But that was officially built in, this idea that they wanted to have balance between the sexes, between the young people and between the old people, between the clans, between the tribes. Even the nations, because when they created the Confederacy, it's created from 6 nations, and they decided that they wanted to stop fighting. And how would they go about doing this? Well, they created a system of government back in the 1100s that could do this. And what was interesting about the fact that any tribe could join the Iroquois Confederacy. They had systems. They were very, very strong in terms of their warriors, but they never had standing armies, and they never went to war themselves. But if there was oratory was what everything was based on in their government systems. But if there were tribes or groups that refused to settle their differences by speaking about it, then they were given a warning. They were given warning 3 times. And after that, if they wouldn't comply and they were still fighting, the Iroquois would go to war. And when that was over, they integrated those people. They didn't conquer them. They didn't massacre and kill anybody. In fact, there's no records of them ever having fought off of their own lands and also having massacred people. So in the same way that they would invite these people to come into the Iroquois Confederacy, if they were following their rules and guidelines, and that meant being peaceful. But also they had all the rights that any other Iroquois citizen would have at that time, including teenagers, old people, women, men, all had equivalent rights. And so I bring this up partly because it wasn't just a system of tribal and country to country where they had this balance, but also they had dual citizens. And when you hear about that, it gets a little murky when you look down over 400 or 500 years of history. Someone who came to live in an Iroquois community, they could eventually, if they got to know the community well enough, they were able to join the Iroquois Confederacy. Just as many groups who wanted protection when colonialism started could join the Iroquois Confederacy. it was originally 5 nations. The Tuscarora joined in the 1700s because they were having so much difficulty. They joined for protection. So it wasn't just that there was obligations on their side, but there was also rights that they gained. They were under the umbrella of the Confederacy, and the Confederacy was strong. When the English population outnumbered the Iroquois 50-1, they were still using the Iroquois for their protection, for enforcers, begging the Iroquois to help them and protect them. So they will get into this influence in the area to do with slavery as well. But so anyway, certainly they had this balance, and the balance of the sexes was paramount within that setup. So Elizabeth Stanton put forth these radical proposals, which were basically Iroquois traditions. Property, the women basically ran the property, as was mentioned by John. They were farmers. Food wasn't just developed in the Western Hemisphere, like growing out in the wild. For them to have 75% of the world's foods that we eat today grown, with only 30% of the land mass, that didn't just happen by picking stuff up. They cultivated, and sometimes over many, many, many generations. Well, who was doing all that work? It was mostly the women. They were the farmers, and labor was one of the aspects of this, with the balance within these societies. The labor force tied in with the property. The women gave birth from people, and I guess there's our Mother's Day connection there, but it has a lot to do with the looking after the land. You're giving birth from the land. They were an agrarian society, so that tells you how important this was. Agriculture was paramount for the Haudenosaunee, and the women were in charge of all that, the planting. I mentioned last time all the beans in the world, which is an important source of protein, all except 2 came from the Western Hemisphere. This is dozens and dozens and dozens of different beans, but the Iroquois themselves had 14 different beans that they had developed. And in the same way as Machu Picchu was a agricultural research center, these foods were being developed on farms over many generations. The nightshade family is a great example that I always enjoy. The nightshade is a deadly poison plant. It grew all over the world, but only the Western Hemisphere, our Indians turned this into a beautiful food to eat. The tomato, the pepper family, those were all part of the nightshade family. And so these foods weren't just growing out in the wild by any means. A balanced diet, we know now that it's almost unbelievable how many of the indigenous had balanced diets, and they were managing for themselves in terms of food. I mean, it's mankind's biggest problem is eating, and once that's solved, you can move on to other things, but the food aspect has to come first. And where Spain was at war for 800 years up until that very year of 1492, that's telling you the difference with the civilizations in some ways, and what they might be concentrating their efforts on. Community rights, I mentioned the lineage by females. These are all aspects of the Iroquois traditions. And when I talk about Elizabeth Stanton borrowing from these when she made her list of sentiments. So another person was Lucretia Mott. Let me touch firstly on the dual citizens. The Elizabeth Stanton was not a dual citizen, but she had adopted Iroquois names. She had visited them many, many times, and she documented in her writings some of the shared cultures and that they had, the shared values that they had, and she was moving in that direction as many other English who were living closely with the Iroquois. So that declaration, this is at the beginning of this convention that she put forth, proposed a number of resolutions acting superior as the men were doing. In her mind, that went against nature and didn't seem like nature operated that way, and that was one of her big arguments in terms of governing it as well too. So another person, Lucretia Mott, she told of her witnessing in the government systems, which she would see the Iroquois conducting their affairs in government, and write about that and comment on that as well, how they did their decision making. And she taught that as providing for a firsthand experience into women's political, spiritual, social, and economic authority. So once again, they're transferring this into their world, saying, well, we want to have this too, and all leading to voting, of course, and having the inherent right to choose. I'd mentioned at the beginning this 1848 convention. Now, the 1840 Anti-Slavery Convention had people from New Zealand, from Australia, from Canada, from the US, from the UK, when it was an early coalescing of some of these thoughts. It didn't happen very quickly after 1848. There was a lot of conventions going on in UK and many of these countries, and certainly in America, but it was a struggle through, they were ostracized and laughed at, and even at the convention, they were, the 40 men that were there tried to cause trouble, right? But it's like many of the changes. We look back on it now, and it's like, oh, here's what they did. But there's quite a few decades in there before anything happened in the early 1900s, and they were working just as hard all the time throughout this to try to get some traction to this idea. They had seen it for themselves, how it could work, and they wanted to bring it to fruition in their society as well, too. So Susan Anthony, she was not at that convention, but her mother and sister attended the convention, and when they got back, I guess she was regretful that she hadn't been there, but she went on to be a very influential person, probably the most in terms of historically. She is on the money as the Australian. Just last year, they put their suffragette person on their $10 bill. So Elizabeth Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Matilda Gage was another person who also paid homage to the Iroquois and the way that they handled the balance between the sexes. Now, she had visited enough that she did become a dual citizen of the Wolf Clan with the Mohawk Nation. Her closest neighbor was a dual citizen, and she had a close cousin who was a dual citizen as well, too. And dual citizen probably meant a little different than what we think of as today. It's just like the Tuscarora wanting to take refuge under this umbrella of the Iroquois Confederacy. And these terms we have, by the way, like bury the hatchet and stuff, that comes from that. The Tree of Peace is what they literally got together, and you were expected to settle your differences. And by the way, it wasn't just some smaller area in New York. At one point, because of colonialism, they had 48 different nations that took refuges in the Iroquois Confederacy. And that land covered more land than the Roman Empire at its peak. So they were pretty influential. And when I get into the slavery part a little bit, the aspect of history, keep in mind, the slaves were being released around that time, 1865. So this was happening in the next 20 years as the women were trying to get traction. They did have abolition that took place. It took 100 years for them to vote until 1965. But this was all going on at the same time. Now, when the Civil War happened, we always think of the Mason-Dixon line. Now, that did have a little bit to do with malaria, and there's whole stories to do with malaria, but most of that was the Iroquois Confederacy again. There was slavery without the Western Hemisphere, but in the Iroquois Confederacy, slavery was outlawed, and it had always been outlawed. It wasn't something that they came and did away with. They never had it, and they refused to participate. So slavery was one of the largest industries in the world. a big enough industry that runaway slaves was a huge industry by itself in North America. And the Iroquois refused to participate in that, and that was a big deal. They had to find indigenous people to track down these blacks that got away, and they were coming into the north. So when the Civil War broke out, the Mason-Dixon line represents the Iroquois sphere of influence right around that area where they held sway in the land, but also among the English people in that part of the world. And Canada is not separated from this. Remember, there was no imaginary line at that time. This is all just one land, like New York and Ontario. When I talk about the Great Lakes, New York, Ontario, Michigan, when we read the land acknowledgements, you know, they have to name a whole bunch of these different tribes because they moved around. It wasn't just all sort of cut and dried, like this is where the line was. So this is something to keep in mind as well. With Matilda Gage, she was very passionate because, as I say, she had neighbors and relatives. She wrote that respect went very deep through every aspect of society. So respect for your clan members, respect for the other tribes, respect for women, respect for the people within your longhouse, within where you're living. And once again, they tried to have this, what I would call sustainable, this balance work throughout all the different levels of what we would call a society. And to the women, it's like, okay, well, we're missing in the New England states and in Europe, we're missing this one element of this balance to have some cooperation that can run through the entire society. So she was big on that aspect of respect. She went on to become president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She later wrote a book in 1880, a little later on, The Women, Church, and the State. So that was a pretty famous book and helped to really spread the word about the suffragette message. She used the term matriarchate first. It's mother rule is what it means. Matriarchate is a little different than just matriarchy. Matriarchate is really a system like run by women. And historians can debate and people can debate whether that's what the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was. I lean toward, yes, that's what it was. But it was more of a cooperative. It wasn't like the men were shut out or anything like that, but it could be called a matriarchate. But that means mother rule, and she was the one who created that term. So the proposals at the convention, they were signed by 100 people. There was the right to property, fair divorce. Most radically was the right to vote. That was actually a very radical idea at that time. And some of the other emphasized ideas were sort of changing the thinking, including women going to college, keeping their own wages, pursuing challenging careers, exercising free speech, basically having equality before the law. So she said that all laws would prevent women from occupying such a station. This is the proposal, one of the proposals at the end of the convention that 100 of the people signed. That all laws which prevent women from occupying such a station in society as her conscience shall dictate, or which place her in a position inferior to that of man, are contrary to the great precept of nature, and therefore of no force or authority. So in other words, just to them, that's like nothing, means nothing, right? Because it's just incorrect. So the Seneca Falls Convention served its purpose as the first ever convention, and they put forth their declaration, which helped to be a springboard for the movement. Really, there was many more conventions. It accelerated the pace and inspired others. Lucy Stone was a person who did attend the convention. She became known later in the wider framework of Iroquois society, overlapping with the rights of women. She was very front and center in that because slavery was one of her big causes, abolition and slavery, and that's how some of these women met each other, was in the abolition movement as well too. So the equal rights in general was also tied in with this versus the class type of system, which almost all the continents had class systems, and equal rights tied into that. So battling inequality on all fronts, and Lucy Stone was certainly known for that, being there. So let's look at when the rights, before we get into a couple conclusions, let's look at when some of these rights. So America, 1920, they didn't all just bring in the vote where we can just say, well, that's when it happened. And UK, for example, was 1918, but it was only like landowning women. There was always kind of like a levels to it. So you could say UK was 1918, and then 1928 it was fully in. And finally these conventions and all the feeding off of each other and working and struggling started to pay off, and that was one of the obvious examples in history we can look at is the vote. New Zealand was 1893, Australia 1902, Canada was also 1918, and they had a couple asterisks with theirs going to 1921, 1922. Black women was 1965, so we know that already. But some of these places, I say the Iroquois, well, 1142, I mean, I'm sure they were developing their system of government at some time in the 1100s, 1200s. Liechtenstein, women started voting there in 1984, so that's a little bit later. Switzerland was 1971, but the very last local government in Switzerland to vote in the ability for women to vote was 1990. So that's not very long ago. That was still happening. So as Lucy Stone was quick to point out regarding all types of oppression, the women's struggles with men and indigenous struggles, they were with the colonial powers or with the dominant culture, they were very similar. They had a lot of similarities. Anyone who's oppressed and looks at their difficulties, just like the indigenous around the world, who have a population of 385 million people, displaced indigenous around the world, making them the third biggest country in the world, their problems are all very, very similar when they get together. They all have the same set of difficulties. The problem blacks were having, the problem the women were having, is very similar that all people that were suffering from inequality and being oppressed had similar situations. So women were treated as inferior, and then that was enshrined in law. The indigenous had been treated as inferior, and that was enshrined in law as well, too. But did women turn out to be inferior? I mean, they found out later. And then the Iroquois, it was an example of how the whole idea can just kind of fall apart when you look at it in history. But at the time, it's very, very real. Well, history will show that our Western Hemisphere indigenous Indians were more advanced than Europeans in 1492. And I didn't start the contest, and Lucy Stone didn't start the contest. Certainly the indigenous did not start the contest, but the Europeans started the contest hundreds of years ago, and it goes on today. That you can see that in the workings and in the writings and behind many, many of the things, still that assumption that Europeans were more advanced. And that's why I like to be extreme and state and say, no, they weren't more advanced. Like, let the show begin if you want to start stacking up who was more advanced than who, right? But the indigenous would never do that. But it's something that I stumble upon so many times that I kind of mention it. But it doesn't follow Scott's axioms. It does. That's good. Yeah, there should always be hope in every message, right? So I'm close to wrapping up here. So women's position in society, it's a small part of the unrecognized contributions of our Western Hemisphere indigenous, and that's what I talk about, is the unrecognized. Why is it invisible? Because it doesn't make people feel very good sometimes. Invisible. It's a time-tested technique when people are being treated poorly to make it into an invisible subject. And racism operates that way. You can do a whole class on that. The fact that, okay, we don't talk about that at all. That's what helps it to sustain itself over time, because it's never discussed. It's just there. So when there is recognition for the indigenous, it's often done sort of begrudgingly, or when attempts are made to celebrate our indigenous, it's often still done from an attitude of pity, and not as historical peers and as equals. They were equals, they were peers, and they lived together, and they were, they helped to build the continent together, really. So just as we remember Arab Spring, when that happened, and they were singing "We Shall Overcome," and automatically, oh, that's an American song, and that reverts back to the Americans. But it doesn't. It reverts back in turn after the Americans to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who introduced those ideas to them. And America gets credit when we hear them singing "We Shall Overcome" during Arab Spring, but it's good for us to remember how that harkens back. The freedom and liberty, which are two terms that are front and center. I think the words are more important in the United States than actual things, but that's another story. But they certainly borrowed all of that from the Iroquois Confederacy and many of the other northern Indians, who many of them did have voluntary forms of government. So, yeah, so it would be okay for us to tip our hat once in a while to the great strides made by our very own northern Indians around the Great Lakes and think of a small debt of gratitude for them. Thank you. It's all yours, Scott.
So as we sung "Love's Call is for All," you've taken us through another aspect of that journey where all was presented and resisted. If you went back far enough, Magna Carta, all the nobles say, not just you, king. So, okay, nobles are in. There's a lot of all not there yet. And layers and layers and layers of us that we cut off into sections of inferiority that become invisible because we don't talk about it. Thank you for that point. It's so important. We don't see it, we don't hear it. And then the example you've drawn for us of a people who strove to make it be all people. And the women issue, not just women with property, not just rich, not just white, all. And that's such a high ideal. We miss out on it because of that invisibility. We don't even know there's a section of people crying.
I brought 2 books there last week. These are not secrets. This is not hidden material. It's easy to get a hold of, but we make it invisible.
And thank you for the research you do that brings it more visible to us. Anyone that's making someone's issue. And I can hear the resistance in everywhere saying, oh, not that too. No, don't tell me about that. And it maybe has something to do with mental health. It could be anything that sections us off and excludes us from the all. So thank you for the depth of that, backed up by your research. And we appreciate that very much when it's well-researched, which doesn't mean we could discover more differently later and add to that whole history of people. So thank you again very, very much for being here.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.